This is episode 204 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Well, Wally, another eventful week, perhaps not quite as much in some regards as the last week, but definitely a lot going on. And in my personal life, I had a little health snafu, if you will. In normal times, you get colds, you get other illnesses, and it's
you don't think anything of it.
You don't think that big of a deal. In this kind of situation, I felt like I needed to leave all my friends and family behind even more than I already had, and just self-quarantine, the whole nine yards. Well, basically, on Thursday afternoon of last week, I was not feeling especially grand, and after I did a radio show and a few other errands, I came back home around 3, and I took the afternoon off, and that's what we call taking it easy at the Rio Grande Foundation. I mostly laid around in bed, and come evening, I had a 101.7 fever, which is, 100.7, I apologize.
Yeah.
Not too off the,
not off the charts,
but it's a fever. It's a fever. I wasn't feeling so hot. Then that broke the next morning. I was feeling fine. I did more or less a normal day. And, these days it's pretty easy to not do a lot of things with a lot of people. So I just kind of worked at home. And, if I get something, my wife and kids are definitely going to get something. But I stayed home, kept cool, and sure enough, Friday evening, and temperature got back up to 100.4, and the wife said, "You need to get tested. We need to figure this out." So up I went to Balloon Fiesta Park at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning, and you got to think the environmentalists. This is their chance. They could have really nailed this. So here is everybody in line for COVID testing for, in my case, an hour and 15 minutes, in their car with the car on. This is a cool, nice morning. This is the
so the air conditioner at least wasn't on high.
Yeah, I wasn't blowing full throttle air, but everybody is sitting there in an hour-long row of cars, just sitting idling. And if you turn your car off, then you have to turn it back on a few minutes later when the line moves. So just saying, environmentalists, you got your work cut out for you, because this is happening all over the country.
Right.
So I eventually get to the front of the line, take my COVID test, which it's not the worst thing in the world. I was under the impression I was going to have this things. If you've seen the graphics on the internet and whatnot, they're like full on, like huge Q-tips going all the way back to the back of your nose. I wasn't having surgery, which that was a question they kept asking me. So it wound up just being a very small, inch or so long Q-tip looking thing, shoved it in my nose. I tickled and sneezed for the next 5 minutes, but eventually the results came back in about 36 hours, so not too bad. And I was COVID free.
Or none detected.
Yes.
None detected.
So, it's good to be free and clear on the virus front. Based on my impression of the symptoms, I really just had that they say COVID is exhibited in people. I had a fever, of course. I was achy and tired, which if you have a fever, by definition, almost you're achy and tired. But I did not have the dry cough, nor was I having the trouble breathing in general. That's another one of those things. So good news, at least for friends of the Rio Grande Foundation. For the haters out there, I guess I'm going to still be around causing you problems. But, I will say that I know there were problems early on in the outbreak where testing was taking 10 days, 12 days, 14 days, or even longer. And, to get the turnaround 36 hours or so is pretty good. It's it's a challenging process, I'm sure, and it took a while to hone it down. But it was a reasonably good experience, and I'm glad that it went that way.
So another negative test result in the New Mexico database.
Yeah. So
that's good. I'm glad you didn't have it, and it is interesting. I too have been through that particular one.
Okay.
I believe they have several different kinds of test kits because people, as I talk to people around the state, I had one that was a little more invasive. It was back there. It reminded me, though, some substance on it reminded me of wasabi that, you mix with your sushi. So it's like a Q-tip.
Hot.
Yeah, it's like, wow, that was intense. And I, too, was none detected. So
nice.
Yes.
Well, Wally, even last week with the protests and stuff that had broken out, if you'd asked me if we'd be talking about abolishing the police this week, I probably would have said you're crazy. But supposedly, and I question whether they'll actually go through with it, but Minneapolis City Council has pledged essentially to abolishing their police force. And this is one of those things, have you ever heard the whole Somalia rejoinder? Anytime a libertarian, and this is, Rio Grande Foundation is not a libertarian organization, although we are familiar with all ideologies, right, left, and center, not all of them, but most of the mainstream ones. And libertarian, there are some thinkers who say that private policing is the way to go.
Right.
And I think I'm glad I'm not living in Minneapolis for many reasons, but privatizing or eliminating government-funded police, if they really go through with it, could be a fascinating social experiment, the likes of which we haven't seen in many moons in this country. So, let's talk about this.
Yeah, and so what are the choices here? I've been thinking about this as I saw your list of topics to talk about. So it's like, okay, we get rid of the police force, the existing police force. What do you do? So do you get another government-controlled police force, meaning it's just the bureaucracy and the people and the embedded power structure? Is that what it is? And we're going to get a new government one, but we're going to, this is a technical, legal, scholarly term, ollie oxen free, where we just start over, but the government's there. Or do we go to a privatized police force? And when you look at kind of the left-right dynamic, the left hates privatized prisons with a passion. It's up there, probably in their top 10 things.
They're not big fans of guns either.
No, they're not.
If I'm living in Minneapolis right now, I'm sure as heck going out and emptying out my piggy bank to go buy a gun because no cops. I mean, we're talking literal anarchy. I'm not just
not figurative. Or are they saying that there's going to be these other, I don't know, I hear these weird little pieces like, well, we're going to take some and put it in mental health, and we're going to let the other first responders like EMTs and fire do this. And but at some level, at some time, somebody is probably going to need a gun, and hopefully we'll have the authority and the training and, to be able to use it. Or, in places where there are not police because they've basically, for whatever reason, they've gone out of business due to political strife or whatever, a police organization forms. Sometimes it's formed by the drug cartels, but there is a police function that happens. So I don't think you can get rid of the function. The question is that who is going to be in charge of it? What are the rules of engagement? How is it going to be managed? Because otherwise it's, those are valid questions right there. But if we're just going to get rid of police, really is any sane person think that major cities in the United States can in any way do anything other than just collapse without any formal police function?
Yeah, it is going to be very interesting. I suspect that the powers that be in Minnesota, Minneapolis will back away from any real abandonment of traditional policing. We shall see. And when I say libertarians, I mean we're talking about very hardcore. This is cutting edge libertarian stuff like privatize all the roads, no government roads,
Right.
privatize. There are plenty of libertarians, people like folks at the Cato Institute who say what we need to do is focus on accountability with police forces,
Right.
reforming unions or eliminating government employee unions in police departments, really addressing accountability, because let's face it, in private contracted policing or other entities have their challenges too, but government monopolies with unions on top of them have very serious challenges with accountability, which brings me to another group that's very similar, and we talked about them briefly last week, but this whole discussion is going so fast and so interesting in many ways about core functions of government. If you look at what is a core function of government, I think most people say police, fire, right off the bat. Like if the local government didn't do anything else.
Police, fire, I'd throw roads in there. And
Roads,
I tend to have historical, classical, libertarian leanings.
Sure.
But yeah, I can deal with the government doing the roads. That's fine. I can imagine a world where the government doesn't do the roads, but that's not the one that's going to keep me up at night. So.
Exactly, right. There have been, I lived in Argentina for a while, and the roads, they didn't spend a lot of money. A lot of European countries are like this. If you drive a car in Europe, you're not only paying the exorbitant gas taxes, but you're paying significant tolls to private companies to maintain the roads and to drive on those. And there's huge flaws in those models as well, because if you're taking this from a principled perspective, you think people should not have to pay the gas taxes and the other fees in order to drive on the roads if you're going to charge them the tolls as well. But Libertopia, the world is not, unfortunately. But education, teachers unions, while generally speaking you don't have the same monopoly on violence that police forces have, government unions, teachers unions, police unions tend to operate very similarly. And lacking accountability to dispense with, to fire government employees is one of the primary things. Like, that's what unions do. They make it difficult to fire their workers, and governments in general are tough to get rid of workers, let alone when you have strong unions involved as well. So the idea that government should be managing the education system in the first place is deeply questionable. It kind of parallels in with the police force, but I mean, if we're getting down to the point where the local government is not even doing policing, it kind of begs the question of what are we paying taxes for in the first place as citizens of whatever city or state or wherever we're living. This could be, again, I would not want to live in Minneapolis at this point. And heaven forbid that Mayor Keller gets a wild hair and decides to follow this path. I don't think it looks like that. I think Mayor Keller wisely understands that we need to go the opposite direction and having more strong policing, more accountability. But
yeah, it's both, so you have the strength of policing, the intensity of the actions of the force, and then you have the management of those. So are they being well managed, or are they being abused? Because yes, I don't think very many Albuquerqueans of any political stripe say we need less policing in Albuquerque.
Right.
They disagree with some of the techniques, tactics, etc. So those are two things to take a look at. But I'm with you. I don't think our mayor is going to be sucked into this. I just don't think it's a political winner for him, first of all.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a crazy idea. And we are, as a city, these federal edicts in terms of how our police force is managed that in a lot of cases take huge resources off the street. We are getting to the point where the light at the end of the tunnel may be seen, where we maybe can get some more appropriate flexibility and not have to have, 5 police accountants for every policeman or woman who's out there on the street. So,
yeah, well, as the Facebook memes often go, the people with the big bucket of popcorn just inserting in their mouth as they watch to see what happens. That'll be Wally and I as we watch to see what happens in Minneapolis and any other city that goes down the path, whether theoretical or otherwise, of really abolishing its police force, because it will be fascinating to watch, not just from a policing perspective, but just from a social perspective. I mean, private police forces have a lot to be said for them, and we've got plenty of them in town, Armed Response Team and others, and I'm sorry if I'm leaving others out, but there's a lot of private police forces because of Albuquerque's traditional high crime and the challenge of getting a police officer. And I walk downtown, our offices are downtown, while the New Mexico Bank and Trust there on Gold has a security guard right there in the front of the building. And that's a minimal show of force, but I think everybody in any of these cities is looking at police options, even though they already do have traditional police forces, and this industry could be a growth one.
Yeah, and final thought on that is if in Mexico City, I've done some business there, and the major companies all have their private police forces not carrying sidearms, carrying assault-style weapons. So, yeah, and lots of them. And in the nicer neighborhoods, and nothing that's larger or more opulent, akin to some of the nicer estates on Rio Grande, parts of Tanawan, the nicer houses, not always even on huge lots, will have one or two armed person with some sort of a rifle or multiple people. So policing happens. And, Mexico certainly has police. I'm not saying that Mexico City doesn't, but there is that private security function that's above and beyond that's happened because people weren't feeling that they were getting the right service from the government provided. So,
yeah. Will be interesting to watch. Well, we've had kind of two stories here, Wally, already before, I think, the big one, the one that probably will take a majority of our time, which is the earthquake that happened last week in New Mexico politics. Not a physical earthquake, although you could feel the ground shift leftward, as it so often does, seemingly, in New Mexico politics. In this case, it was a Democratic primary. Of course, Republicans also had their primaries, but the legislature, and we can talk about all manner of races, but by now people are pretty aware of the turnout and how that all went down. The legislature is going to be a changed body in unprecedented ways come 2021.
Yeah, the progressive targeted Democratic senatorial seats that the progressives went after, all but one of those was won by the progressives. Mm-hmm. So the shift there. Now, a couple of those seats, there is a reasonable chance for a Republican to win in the general election. But the bottom line is that in all likelihood, there will be not only from a Democrat-Republican kind of power shift, there will certainly be a more progressive Democrat shift. And when you have the majority like they do in Santa Fe, and, there's the name above all names of fiscal conservative in New Mexico is no longer there. So Senator John Arthur Smith, who had a long and distinguished career, basically, what would you say, the adult in the room through many crazy times here in New Mexico, he's not going to be there in Santa Fe.
Yeah, and there's a lot to discuss here, so buckle up. We've got a lot to talk about. Certainly, the shift and the loss of John Arthur Smith is the most momentous of all the races that we saw change. And that's one of them. Like you said, there's a handful of these races that I think Republicans have fair chances to win. There's certainly got to be hope that they hold serve on candidate or races like Bill Payne's seat here in Albuquerque, and that they maybe make inroads like maybe Senator John Sapien's seat in Sandoval County. Sapien was always sort of a moderate. But what we really have seen here clearly is that the Democratic Party in New Mexico is now a progressive, unified, top to bottom, all across their platforms, if you will. There are very few non-progressives in the Democratic Party in New Mexico in any position of power. The only guy I would even, at this point, say, I mean, at a statewide level, like you could talk about Sam Cobb down in Hobbs, who's the mayor, but that's a conservative area to elect a Democrat. I would say Tim Eichenberg, the treasurer, is not a progressive, but that's thin gruel indeed, Wally.
Sorry, Mr. Eichenberg, if that gets the target on your back. But yeah, it's crazy. So the thing that occurs to me is if it really is going to be as progressive as this, and we've seen the progressive over-the-top things get through the House and then get killed in the Senate. That's been going on for, pardon the pun, progressively for the past 6 or 8 years, right, getting stronger and stronger, and barely being able to be held off now in the last session in the Senate in Santa Fe. So what policies are, pardon my leanings, in danger of being inactive? The progressives would say, what are they, what are the ones that are going to be there? And I have my list, I'm sure you have yours. Okay. And a lot of them could be really problematic.
Let's throw some of these out here.
Okay.
So I think the first and foremost thing, because of John Arthur Smith, and first and foremost, the groups that I know that really played here were Everytown. This is Bloomberg's anti-gun group,
right?
And Planned Parenthood. They're really after that abortion law. Now, those two issues, we care about guns here at the Rio Grande Foundation. We've had numerous podcasts on that. We're very concerned about the gun stances of some of these progressives. But our bread and butter is fiscal issues. So we've got John Arthur Smith out the door. That means you've got to think the permanent fund is in deep peril starting this coming legislative session. The governor has a path forward. No tough decisions during the special, just chewing gum and baling wire to 2021, and they've got the permanent fund.
Yeah, and I think that's correct. And I've started to have this discussion with many people, and they were like, well, but you need to go, it needs to go to the U.S. Congress to get approval. I think there's ways that they get a ton more money out of the permanent fund, just because most of the beneficiaries are schools anyway, that get way more funding than just what comes out of the land grant permanent fund. And so if you just say, we're going to take we're going to take more money and put in education, that frees up money for elsewhere.
Money is fungible.
Yes.
Exactly.
So I think you can spend, if you can get the distributions high, you can spend a ton more money. Mm-hmm. The other issue is, how many times, once you go to the well, how many times will we go to the well? So, we've seen a lot of volatility, and to get any decent risk, even before the stock market crash because of COVID-19, you were having to have a lot of money in equities, and there's a lot of volatility and things like that. So, okay, we start taking a lot more out, and the fund starts to shrink. Therefore, the fund distributions are smaller at these higher levels. What, do we start to take even more? Do we bleed it down? I don't know. Paul, I've jokingly said, and let me just say, this is a joke, but this is a good thought experiment. What if we had the year of Jubilee where we liquidated the entire land grant permanent fund and wrote every New Mexican a check for the thousands of dollars? What would that look like? Just as a way to say, because at some level, that's what we were balancing out, is the ability of that fund to just be spent right now versus to be there to stabilize the finances of the state over time.
Well, the Rio Grande Foundation will not be anywhere near the cheerleading section for any of these policies. However, it is better to do this than to raise taxes, and we'll get to that discussion in a few minutes. We have serious concerns. We did a deep dive into the permanent fund issue in New Mexico on a previous podcast. While we think the defending the funds is fine. Our main concern is that they just drive the size of government inexorably higher, removing accountability. This is a time when we would see some right sizing in government instead of going to that piggy bank. And that's what we were hoping for with John Arthur Smith there, is that he would effectively close off the permanent fund as a source of money, and instead we would see some actual changes in government and reforms. Very unlikely to see that. We're just going to see government grow and grow. However, we might see some temporary stimulus money thrown out there indirectly out of the permanent fund, out of tapping that to help businesses. And Bill Richardson himself, in his op-ed that we talked about last week, talked about cutting the Social Security tax. Well, you can kind of get there if you use the permanent fund to do it, and it'll be very interesting. Our governor, I think, in general, has shown a very limited grasp of basic politics, whereas Bill Richardson has always been Mr. Politics. Never the twain shall meet. Very big differences there. The governor can either do this, the partisan left wing, we're going to just ram this down your throats way, or she can butter up some of these more squishy Republicans, especially in economically struggling areas, and say, oh, let's talk. We'll get you some stimulus money. We'll have the state do various things, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. She could plausibly see a path towards kind of political compromise there. Not that I'm saying this is the Rio Grande Foundation's plan. We need to cut government and address spending and right-size things, but we're not going to get that. Just period. It's not going to happen.
No, and even my thought experiment, there's a couple of funds, but, let's just land grant permanent fund, $15 billion to just throw a number. I haven't looked at it in a while, but, $15 billion would be $7,500 approximately for every man, woman, and child in New Mexico.
That is not going to happen.
I know, but it's, if you were to do that, mm-hmm. it's a lot of money on the one hand, mm-hmm. but still you can't do every policy that you want, even if you were to say we're going to all spend at one time.
True.
And so that's a one-time spend. That does not sustain any program, So all of these things that take tons of money, and that's one of the things that we've talked just a little bit about at the federal level too. When we're in the 25 trillion in debt at the federal level, adding trillions at a time, there is a limit even at the federal government, who has the ability to print money. In New Mexico, we have these piggy banks that have a certain level of protection around them. But even if we were to take away all that protection, that money, it goes a ways. Don't get me wrong. $7,500 for every man, woman, and child in New Mexico would go a ways, but that doesn't solve every problem that the state has. Far from it.
No. And the permanent funds that we've had haven't solved our problems, because, as the Rio Grande Foundation's, view is of these things, the permanent funds were set up on a flawed premise to begin with, which is that these are finite resources that we're going to run out, and we have to keep this money set aside for future generations. Well, the single most important natural resource is the human mind. This is going back to Julian Simon and other free market economists. Mankind, when liberated from bad government policy, will generate new ideas, new ways to make money, new ways to extend and expand the human existence. We don't need a big pot of money for government to tap into to do that. We need a streamlined, efficient, well-functioning, non-corrupt government. I know I'm fantasizing, but doing very few things, but doing them relatively well. And that is, I couldn't come up with much that is farther apart than New Mexico and good government. And I'm not just talking as like some wild-eyed policy analyst, but I'm talking like we're constantly rated as one of the worst governed states in the entire country. There's reasons for that, and we see them, and it's going to be a very interesting time. Well, that wasn't all that happened on election night, but I do want to give you a chance, Wally, because I see a spreadsheet over there of all the things that you see as changing due to the land shift, the big shift we saw on election night. Do you want to throw out another one or two items that you see as particularly momentous? Because the economic thing is big. Legalized weed, is that another one you're going
Yeah, I think Up in Smoke is getting ready to happen. And so, the key is New Mexico will get to learn how other states have learned who have legalized. Will there be some benefits? Yeah, there probably will be. There'll probably be some, but there's cost as well. And so, yeah, I think that one will absolutely be unleashed.
Maybe in a special session. It could happen. I doubt it.
I doubt it, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess she wouldn't because she has too much opposition. But, yeah, it'll happen probably in 2021, I think, without a doubt.
And then some of the things that the various business groups have fought for, they fought for a more reasonable approach to the raising of the minimum wage, where you keep the tip credit for restaurants and you do it slowly as opposed to just throwing it in at $15. And then the key is that once you get $15 minimum wage, let's put 20, let's put 25. So that's in there, between COVID-19 and the fact that at some point the feds have provided basically sick leave for COVID for everyone. I think that one that's on the table. And so I think a lot of those are there. The one that we've talked about is now how are we going to pay for the shortcoming in gross receipts tax, the primary tax source in the state of New Mexico? Will there be tax increases? And, it's one of those things I don't think there should be. There are many people that don't think you should raise taxes, including former Democratic governors of our state. But if I were to guess, I would say there would be tax increases. I think, and I think they will not be as much of a revenue generators people think. I think that state corporate income taxes will be raised. Well, there's not a whole lot of entities that are paying state corporate income taxes in New Mexico that are having income that'll make a big deal. Doesn't matter. We'll probably do that. Will there be more raises of the gross receipts tax? Man, I hope not. But that's one of the ones that that could be the killer. That's one of you raise the gross receipts tax high enough without reforming it, and that could really, we're facing headwinds, to use the metaphor for our economy. We could be sailing right into the wall of a hurricane hitting us if we don't do something to reform our gross receipts tax and raise it at the same time. So those are my fear-based ones. Those are the ones that when I'm on Excel or having dreams, either one, I can be very afraid.
Those are some pretty reasonable fears to have, especially given the article that we're going to discuss next, but not quite next, because it wasn't just all about the moderate Democrats getting beaten up and the progressives taking over their party. And we'll see. We have an election day. There's going to be a lot of Republicans running in these races. It'll be a high bar indeed for them to wind up taking the Senate, for example. At least it's a plausible opportunity given the shifts we've seen. There's going to be a lot more competitive seats for Republicans to try for. But it's going to be, I think, eight seat pickup. That would be a very challenging order to make. But there were a couple of ideologically disparate races. We talked about them, I think, last week. David Gallegos unseated Greg Fulfer, and that's a more conservative voice, as well as Greg Schmiedes beating Jim White here in the Albuquerque area. The Gallegos-Fulfer race was down in Hobbs. So two more ideologically conservative state senators going to be taking their seats in 2021. And I kind of not so jokingly said that Republicans in the Senate won't have John Arthur's skirts to run around in anymore and hide behind because the flip side of John Arthur Smith is, well, he signed on to 21% budget increases over the last 2 years. He's signed on to hundreds of millions of dollars poured into Hollywood subsidies. He's signed on to a lot of the policies that we've seen over the years. Now, he is one man. He's a powerful man, but he gets to that position through some degree of compromise. But now, especially on the Senate side, the cheese stands alone, to quote a children's book that I've read many times. But yes, the cheese stands alone. The Republicans stand alone Now they don't have John Arthur Smith to kind of intervene with the rabble-rousing left in their own party.
Yeah, and you are right. John Arthur Smith did, in the last few years, he did go along with certain things. But even when he did, he was always like, we need to be careful, we need to be careful, we need to be careful. Having said that, he went along with a lot of things. Will there be voices that rise out of the Republican Party, and particularly the Senate, that are articulate and able to communicate with the public? Because that is a big issue. You know, if you only hear one side of things in the media, and if you only hear one side things from the political parties in Santa Fe, you may not even know that there's another way to happen. And I think that's assuming, and you know, I think it's a safe bet. I think you could get pretty good odds in Las Vegas that the D's would retain control of the Senate in New Mexico. I'm not, you know, saying they will, but it's, you know, odds are they will. But there is this communication aspect to the public. Who will take that role on? You know, there have been a few people that have tried, but they haven't gotten as much traction as you sort of would like to see. But who is, you know, what do they call that in Britain? The worthy opposition, or, who is that person that it puts it out there and explains it every day, you know, without wagging your finger at people, or, you know, being somebody that people don't want to listen to and that they tune out.
The loyal opposition is
the loyal. Yes, thank you. That was the term. I appreciate that. Yes.
Well, if you want to see the alternative universe where the inmates are running the proverbial asylum in the Senate, you could look at a recent piece by Jerry Ortiz y Pino. And folks, Senator Ortiz y Pino, as I note in a blog posting at heirsoфenchantment.com, and he wrote an article, I was responding to it, from the Albuquerque Journal. Jerry's a good guy. He's at least...
He is a very nice man.
Very nice
if
person.
You get to sit next to him at a rubber chicken dinner, he is a nice man to sit next to. No question about that.
He's kind of the vanguard of progressives in the New Mexico Senate, you know, before Antoinette Cedillo Lopez, you know, by a decade or so, got there, and a lot of these other progressives that have come along. Jerry was there, and he was known as Comrade Jerry, and he was very to the left. He had a lot of power and moved up in the seniority chain, but always had to deal with some of these more fiscally conservative types in his own party. Now it's Jerry Ortiz Pino's party, really, in all true sense of the word. And he wrote in this opinion piece, the title, as I know you'll enjoy, was Ending New Mexico's Oil Addiction. Now, this is one of those moments where oil and gas and the budget really are going to be unified in a significant way, because for a lot of the last couple of years, the oil and gas industry has been paying the mafia, i.e. our governor, stay away money. We're funding you, we're happy to do so, just don't to destroy us. Well, Jerry Ortiz y Pino, he doesn't even mention the environment in that op-ed. He just wants to be done with oil and gas, even if it costs him 30 or 40% of the state budget. And of course, how we're going to fund government. And I always say that we're addicted to oil and gas in the same way you and I are addicted to food. We eat food. Sometimes we may eat too much, but if we don't eat so much food, we wind up shrinking. Unfortunately, New Mexico's government doesn't shrink very often. Anyway, he calls for all manner of tax increases. Let's see, he wants to eliminate the tax cuts of 2003, that deep thoughts. Do you remember what New Mexico politician got? Oh, that was Bill Richardson.
Yes.
And the Democrats passed that one. Jerry wants to eliminate any of Susana Martinez's tax cuts, which were much smaller, by the way, than Richardson's. Eliminate GRT exemptions. I'm sure the wind and solar ones will be right there on the list for them to eliminate.
Well, and then, eliminating quote-unquote GRT exemptions, that's Senator Scher's plan, by the way.
But at a 2%.
At 2%. Now, if and it's amazing how you don't have to get very far into that discussion to where, oh, no, this isn't an exemption. This is something it looks like an exemption, but it's not.
Right.
And so, yeah, okay, fine. Eliminate all GRT exemptions, but if you eliminate them all, and you brought the rate down, heaven forbid things that, I didn't see myself saying at the start of the hour, I would agree with Senator Ortiz-Pino. That would be a good way to go. But if you don't bring the rate down, then all you do is make us have the equivalent of a value-added tax from Europe without the deduction for the earlier phase, plus an income tax, plus real estate taxes, every other tax. It'd be crazy.
The Ortiz-Pino plan, such as it is, and I don't think of it as much of a plan.
Right.
He claims that oil and gas is 30% of the state economy. Previous reports have said 40%. Potato, we'll just say between 30 and 40% of New Mexico's state budget. I'm sorry, I sometimes say economy for that. 30 to 40% of our budget eliminated because he says we can't rely on it. So you've got a bunch of tax increases. He does ironically say that we should tap the land grant and severance permanent funds, which, Jerry, those come from oil and gas.
It doesn't matter, but that was then. This is now. Money is fungible once it's in the government's coffers.
Yes. Jerry Ortiz-Pino also would like to raise capital gains taxes and increase taxes on alcohol, tobacco, and gasoline. If he does anything like this, or the Democrats do anything like this, they will literally be taxing in additional ways every single person in the state of New Mexico in a much more significant way, which, again, as we mentioned, contrary to the wise counsel of that scholar, Bill Richardson, who said not to raise taxes, in fact, to cut taxes. Now, I will offer you the floor here, Wally, with a final statement on this issue. Wallet Hub, they do, in this case, it's just polling, so you can flat out say whatever you want, but it's polling, and I think it's a pretty straightforward poll. After the economy recovers, should tax rates go up to cover the cost of the coronavirus pandemic? If anything, that is boosting the number of people supporting tax increases, because you're implying that the economy has somehow recovered. Now,
yeah, that is a leading question.
Yeah.
In polling, that's one of the big weaknesses, is you can turn people. That turns them to say, yeah, I'm for that. All things being equal.
It's assuming that the economy will recover.
Right.
Some of it will, some of it won't, let's be honest. Anyway, 72% of the people surveyed nationwide said, no, do not raise taxes. 28% said yes. I probably would say that New Mexico, which you'd be surprised that the way we're politically governed, how normal we are when it comes to a lot of these polling questions. So I would assume the numbers are very reflective in New Mexico. So the Democrats, to an extent, do have a tough road to hoe politically, but the problem is, in this state, the Republicans have never been able to form a coherent political opposition to the point where they win enough races to defeat them for whatever reason. But I do think raising taxes, and RioGrandeFoundation.org/pledge, if you are a legislative candidate who does not want to raise taxes and pledges not to do so through at least the end of the 2021 session. And folks, please send those pledges to your legislators or legislative candidates to ensure that they sign. Because darn it, especially Republicans, but any political party at this point, should not be raising taxes on New Mexicans. Anyway, with that all said, I do think that raising taxes in New Mexico has some serious peril politically for Democrats if the progressives come in and govern just like we expect progressives to govern.
Yes, and as we talked, because their incomes are relatively low in New Mexico, raising the income tax even astronomically amongst only high wage earners will not bring you that much money. So to be, quote, progressive in New Mexico and raise taxes, you have to do things that are probably pretty regressive, like raising taxes on gas, putting tax back on food and other things. The other thing is that, one of the political things about raising taxes is that smart politicians that like to do it in ways that aren't directly attributable to government. Well, if you raise taxes on gasoline, people see that and they know about it and they talk about it. So it's very interesting. Now, not to give them ideas, there are ways that you can raise taxes that it's tough to keep out of the eyes of the eventual consumer that are very effective. Excise taxes, for example. You put it on the production of goods and then you make producers pay for it. I'm not advocating that.
Which is one of the things about the gross receipts tax that really is challenging, because it's not an excise tax in the same way you think of, but
no,
there's a lot of excise input tax oriented things about the
the layering or the pancaking. You only see the one time you pay it when you buy a good or a service. You don't see the other times that it went into above. So yes, so I guess that's my final thought is there are, to be really, really progressive tax-wise in New Mexico, meaning take a lot of taxes, you're going to have to do things I have a feeling are very regressive in nature, hurt the poor, hurt low-income people, keep people from moving from the lower classes into the middle class. And is that a good political strategy? I'm not sure. I don't think it is, but that doesn't mean it won't be tried, because it's been tried a lot of places around the country, definitely been tried places around the world. So
yeah, and of course, Ortiz y Pino's making all of these points based on the fact that oil and gas has plummeted. Prices remain below 40, but not much below $40 a barrel. We could see before, few months, production start to pick up again in southeast New Mexico. I don't know. It's a very fraught situation. Economy's definitely opening. The stock market's going bananas, which is just crazy. But I think it's going to be a significant deficit situation. I don't think even the progressives will try to put the kibosh on the entire oil and gas industry. Even Antoinette Cedillo Lopez, another senator there, very far left progressive, her anti-fracking bill is, quote, only on new fracking and that kind of thing, which would ultimately be the death knell of the industry. But it's a very problematic situation, because you would be able to draw a clear line from the Democratic policies to the economic devastation of New Mexico. And there's just not enough blood in the turnip, so to speak, to get 35% of New Mexico's budget made up without oil and gas at this point. Certainly not doing things the way Jerry Ortiz y Pino wants to do. Pot will not, every New Mexican will be walking around stoned out of their minds 24/7, and they still won't be able to pay the taxes.
No, the old political slogan of chicken in every pot, and so if we have pot in every New Mexican, that still doesn't get us there. And back to my number, so that's 7,500. If liquidate the permanent fund, it's a finite resource. Then the other thing that Senator Ortiz y Pino, I don't believe, talked about, I skimmed the article, I didn't read it in depth. He didn't talk about cutting back government functions, did he?
Well, no. I know. That would be Rio Grande Foundation-esque. I don't think he wants to fall into that category. So elections have consequences, folks. We saw another momentous one last Tuesday, and it does look like Comrade Ortiz y Pino's going to not just have a hearing for his ideas in Santa Fe now, he's going to be really governing the state Senate in New Mexico. So
the final scary thought is new normal, and is Ortiz y Pino the new moderate? Is he the voice of the moderate part? Because the folks who were elected in the primary on the D side, if they make it to be up in Santa Fe, they may make Ortiz y Pino be the moderate one. So we'll have to see. That's what people care about.
Here's a counterfactual. Let's say that a miracle happens. The Republicans have a decent showing in Santa Fe in November, in elections, I should say, and they're like one, maybe two members short of a working majority. What do they offer the remaining moderates in the Democratic Party to get them to come over? What chairmanship and all those kinds of things. I would think that there would be some serious wheeling and dealing for potentially moderate Democrats to come over to the Republican side.
And that's been the history of the Senate in New Mexico for a long time, is a loose coalition that's weakened to the point, and yes, absent, and I'm not saying that the R's aren't going to pick up a ton of seats in the New Mexico Senate. I'm saying what happens if they don't.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.